first subject we dealt with was identifying the symbolic nature, the essentially symbolic nature of the terms sin, or not sin, but Satan, devil, the evil one. And we realized that while there is no essential reality of evil, that we need a term to describe the results of turning away from goodness or the light. Of course, using that metaphor, if you turn away from the light, you're in darkness. And the consequences are that you won't navigate very well. You'll bump into stuff and your life will be miserable. And so, while there is no essential source of evil, we determined that the results of turning away from good are horrific. And we need a term to describe that effect of that cause. And so we use dramatic terms. And it's those terms which we use to describe what causes us to use our free will to turn away from the light. All of those terms represent in Baha'i parlance the self. Not the self in the sense of our soul, our essential reality, but the self in terms of pride, of love of self as opposed to love of the other, or love of that source from which we emanate, namely the heavenly realm of God. So we discussed the nature of the soul, the nature of these symbolic terms, Satan, the evil one, all this as having purely symbolic meaning, but still what they symbolize is something very powerful. Then yesterday we discussed the process outlined in the Baha'i writings, which we called, for our purposes, a personal IPG. An IPG is an acronym in Baha'i parlance today, which represents intensive programs of growth. And we use them to represent how communities around the Baha'i world are trying to revolutionize society from the ground up. Because just as we know you cannot legislate morality, you really can't create a coherent governance by mandating it. The people have to have coherence in what they think should be going on at the community level. So Baha'is around the world are attempting to build communities, not just of Baha'is, even though with all the children running around, you think that's what we're trying to do, is to bring forth a new race of men by multiplying ourselves. But we're trying to incorporate non-Baha'is, and in fact, in many of these programs, and most of these programs that are thriving around the world, the majority of people are not Baha'is, but they are assisted nonetheless because the processes work. Well, so yesterday we described the sequence of actions that, whether as an individual or a family or a community, we can improve ourselves. Of course, it takes free will, the recognition of what it is you want to emulate, and then the volition and the implementation of that volition into a course of action. Not once, but repeatedly until it becomes systematic and until it becomes habituated, until your response to reality and the virtues you employ to respond appropriately are part of your nature. You can actually transform your nature. Well, today we're going to the third and final part of this process of development. Final in every sense of the word, as far as we can sense it, namely the afterlife. What is the relationship between this life and the next life? And as we said yesterday, there is a tendency among most religions, and Baha'is are not immune to this, to think of the next life as sort of a reflection on what you've done here, and this is the real life, and the next life is simply a sort of static existence where you are relegated to some position or some condition wherein you are appropriated to associate with those who did about as well as you did. So you have your destiny and your own control in that sense, from that point of view. So what we're going to go over today are passages that relate to this process of what happens when we pass from this life to the next. Now we'll begin with a very simple analogy. And as I said at the very first class, what's wonderful, among other things, about the Baha'i Faith is that it assumes that everything related to religion and reality itself is logical. And if it's logical, it can be explained in simple terms. And if it can be explained in simple terms, then even a child can understand virtually every important axiom related to Baha'i theology or the Baha'i beliefs. Baha'is belief about the human ontology. What is our nature? What is our being? It's a spiritual essence, as we said in the first class, that emanates from the spiritual realm, associates for a period with the physical avatar through our brain-body relationship. And then as we grow older, as we saw on that graph, eventually you have detachment. Hopefully you participate willingly in that detachment where you become less and less dependent on your physical self as an expression of your inner self. But whether you choose to do it or not, God has designed our lives in such a way that your physical self is going to be torn away from you whether you like it or not. So you're going to be detached. And the ultimate detachment, of course, is what we, those of us who are negatively really call death. But it's really not death, it's really being born into another realm. And the simple analogy I was alluding to a second ago is an analogy we use with children in explaining it, but it's not just with children, it's from the writings of Baha'u'llah, and he says this life in relation to the next life is comparable to the life, the uterine life of the child in the womb of its mother. Everything that occurs in the development of the child in the womb is geared not towards the life in the womb, but towards this life. Everything that's occurring to it is preparation for the capacities, the physical senses and physical apparata that the child will need to navigate this world. He says, in the same way, everything that happens to you in this world is in preparation for your birth into an even more expansive existence. And as I said yesterday, one unfortunate thing is we sometimes reverse those and think the next life is lesser than this, in the sense that it's just a sort of, well, you did this well, so you stay here, and that's it. I hope you're happy. Sit there and enjoy relaxing, because you've earned it. And as I also said yesterday, merely relaxing would be hell for me, and I don't desire it. The fact is the writings don't support it. The writings say that we will have a service in the next world and that it will be greater by the same comparison to the degree that the life in this world is greater than the life in the womb, so our life in the next world is more expansive, more important. And so today's class is simply going over some of the basic axiomatic statements about what that transition is like and what that life will be like. As I've mentioned several times, Christopher Dunbar has a very nice three-part talk on the immortality of the soul, and he gets into great details. His own wife had an NDE experience, near-death experience, and so he talks a lot about that in a very interesting way. We're not going to dwell on it so much. So, what are the basic components of our passing from this life to the next? We already saw yesterday that those powers that make us distinctly human, of reason, will, imagination, abstract memory, and so on. All of those things, because they are powers of the soul, translated or transmitted or transceived through the brain, the separation of the soul from its relationship to have to express itself through the body, all those powers go with us. So our memory of this life is still with us. In other words, everything that makes you distinctly what you are. This is your personality, your individuality, and so on. So we're going to read some of the writings that relate to the axioms relating to our experience in the next life. The first thing that happens, and we have that in the hidden word, regarding bring thyself into account each day, and of course that's what yesterday's workshop was about, and I hope it worked for you. If you take it home with you, that paper and that exercise, and try to use it, it actually works in transforming yourself. So we bring ourselves into account each day, and as you know, a day can be very symbolic in Scripture. It can mean the whole revelation or dispensation. Sometimes it represents a year, and so on. But if you think of it in terms of your own life, the cycle of life, Frank Sinatra did that. You know, when I was 17, you know, it was very hard. He's in the winter of his life, or the autumn of his years, but he's deceased now, so he's in the late winter, I guess. Well, he's probably in the spring of his infinite life now. But enough about Frank Sinatra. I'm sorry, I always get sidetracked on Frank Sinatra. If you think of your own life in terms of the daily cycle, you get up in the morning, the dawning of a new day, new revelation, and you prepare for the day by reading from the writings, saying your prayers. You do your best to implement those changes that you think will help you advance, and so on. And at the end of the day, you reflect on how you did, and you plan for the next day. So the Baha'i writings in that hidden word say, bring yourself into account each day, ere thou art summoned to a reckoning. And it says that, for death will come unheralded. Unheralded. What does that mean? You're all right. Suddenly, without warning, maybe today, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. Who knows? We don't know. And so, as one Baha'i, when I did this same program before, said, you know, I think the more we do this, the more seriously we do this on a daily basis, the less our life review will be traumatic for us, because there'll be no surprises. Well, there'll be some surprises. You know, things we did that were good, that we didn't realize were so good, things that we did that were inappropriate, that we thought, oh geez, it really hurt that person, that's a shame. So, it is clear and evident that all men shall, and again, mutatus mutandi, whatever is applicable to one gender is applicable to the other. So the word men is used generically in the Baha'i writings. It means humankind. It is clear and evident that all men shall, after their physical death, estimate the worth of their deeds and realize all their hands have wrought. I swear by the day star that shineth above the horizon of divine power, that they who are the followers of the one true God shall, the moment they depart out of this life, experience such joy and gladness as would be impossible to describe, while they that live in error shall be seized with such a fear and trembling, and shall be filled with such consternation as nothing can exceed. Well is it with him that hath quaffed the choice and incorruptible wine of faith, through the gracious favor and manifold bounties of him who is the Lord of all faiths. And of course, the trick with this, or the problem with this statement is, how do we know if we are the followers of the one true God? And how do we know if we failed? And the answer is, we don't. Exactly. I mean, we sense it. All right? There's what is called in the Baha'i writings the city of certitude, which means you feel confirmed. But as we're going to discuss in this class, there is no point in the Baha'i writings where you have this concept of salvation, as you do in the Protestant faith and various other religions, that you do one particular act and that's it. You're clear. You're saved. There is no such point in the Baha'i faith. Because why? Because there is no stasis in human development. There is no point at which you're either progressing or regressing. You can't stay still. If you stay still and do the same thing you did yesterday, then you're regressing because you're supposed to be progressing. All right, so relative to what you're supposed to do, stasis is equivalent to regression. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. So, who are the followers of the one true God? We don't know, do we? It doesn't give a name. It doesn't say Baha'is. All right? And there are people who have never heard of the Baha'i faith or never heard of any religion, who may be, according to the exigencies of their life, be doing extremely well spiritually. So that's why, as we said in the first class, you not only cannot assess the spiritual development of anyone else, judge not that ye be judged, you really can't even assess how you're doing except by daily assessment and saying, I know I can do better, I know I can do better. There's a statement in the Baha'i writings, as there is in most religions, God never tests us beyond our capacity. And Bill Sears used to like to say, in times of stress, he would look up to the sky, symbolically, since God is everywhere, and say, are you sure you know my capacity? And, because he suffered a great deal. And you'll find that most of the Baha'is of stature and merit did suffer a great deal, and you don't know if, again, this is divinely sent or simply some people suffered. Now, this is a question we haven't answered yet, and we will soon, and that is, why do the innocent suffer? Why is there injustice, not from society only? We know why that happens, because people willfully turn away from proper governance and proper action towards one another. That's why this experience we have here so briefly in Baha'i school is such a lovely whiff of what society could be like. Just in the sense, again, of trust, friendliness, kindness, helping one another, assisting one another. You get a sense of what a community could be. But what about those, as we've said before, who through no fault of their own or anyone else are encumbered from seeming to have a just opportunity to develop in this life? What happens to them? Well, we've already said they are taken care of, but we'll deal with that more explicitly later. Suffice it that while this is reassuring in one sense, it's frightening in another. So we bring up the concept of another axiom, the fear of God. Every religion talks about it, and they talk about it as if it's a good thing. The fear of God. Well, you can understand it with Old Testament. Because in the Old Testament, you have this image of God, because you were dealing with people in a childlike state of development, the Hebrew children. They were called children because they had been recently freed from slavery, and they had no capacity, and so Moses trained them for 40 years how to have capacity, how to form governance, to come from place to place, and said, okay, now let's see you do it. Now let's see you do it again. And when they were ready, then they became a nation, a mighty nation. The point is that the fear of God then was quite literally an image of a jealous and vengeful God. But of course, God has been the same since the beginning that has no beginning. But the images are appropriate to the people who are being taught. In the same way you'd use different images with your child than you will with your teenage child or with your youth and your adults you're speaking to. The image of God is different. So the image of God, though God is never changing, is a God of love and logic. That everything in creation has a logical relationship to what we talked about the first day, God's intention, which is to create a being capable of freely recognizing this essentially unknowable being, but who is eminently knowable in his attributes, and being attracted to the beauty and the love of that being. So we have these powerful phrases that I've highlighted here. We'll be aware of the good things that escaped us. This is a different passage, so I'll read through it, but the passages highlighted are sort of the emphatic points. The souls of the infidels. Now, what is an infidel? Well, again, this term has a connotation in contemporary society that's scary, because we think of the pan-Islamic movement and so forth. All right? So what does it mean? Well, in this context, you will see it's referring to people who have willfully turned against what they know to be proper behavior, or godly behavior. The souls of the infidels, however, shall, and to this I bear witness, when breathing their last, be made aware of the good things that have escaped them, and shall bemoan their plight, and shall humble themselves before God. They shall continue doing so after the separation of their souls from their bodies. And here, notice, we're dealing not with the entire experience in the afterlife. We're dealing with the first step. What is that? Life assessment. And of course, those who've had NDE experiences, near-death experiences, talk about that. Talk about how, in effect, they had a life review and were made aware of what they'd done well, what they'd done poorly. So those who have actively violated spiritual law, whether it was explicit law or simply what they knew they could do better, shall be made fearful of what they lost, the opportunity that they lost to advance. Why? Because advancing is good for them, and it's good for those that they could have helped. That is one little first insight we have into what is meant by the fear of God. It's not fearing God, it's fearing our reaction to this completely benign and loving being. In the same way that you fear gravity if you're on the edge of a cliff. I don't fear it now, because if it weren't here, I would not be staying on the stage. I'd be floating in the air. I love gravity right now. I wish, since gravity is proportional to the two masses attracting each other, I wish my mass were less. It would be easier on my feet and my knees, all right? But nevertheless, I like gravity, because that way the people in Australia are not, even though they're upside down, floating off somewhere. So gravity is our friend, but we fear gravity as a law if we try to violate it. Because you don't violate gravity. I'm going to defy gravity. I'm going to jump off this building and defy it. But of course, you don't break the law of gravity. You defy it, and you break yourself on the law of gravity. And that's true with every spiritual axiom as well. That's a physical law. It has an analogous law in the Baha'i writings, which is what? What does gravity symbolize? The mutual attraction of things. What does that symbolize? Love. Love is an inherent power within us. We are inherently, instinctively attracted to other people. That's implanted with us. Another that is implanted in us, the Baha'i writings say, is this on? Yeah. We have the first emanation from God to man, the writings say, is science, the love of knowledge. We want to know how stuff works. That's inherent in us. It is clear and evident that all men shall, after their physical death, estimate the worth of their deeds and realize all their hands have wrought. I swear by the day star that shineth above the horizon of divine power, and so on. Now, this is what we saw in this past passage here, so I won't read it again. I think it's the same. Is it exactly the same? Yep. Okay. So we get to the second axiom. We prepare. There's a twofold purpose in going through what we did in their exercise in the workshop yesterday. One is to improve ourselves spiritually, and therefore develop ourselves by increments and habituating virtues and assessing how we're doing. And as we also saw in our discussion yesterday, it's to get an ever more expansive sense of ourself, to become less selfish and more selfless. All right? So that our definition of self isn't just my individual well-being, but the well-being of my family, my community, and humankind. And this all leads us to a law that Ken is going to get into in his 3 classes. One is the concept of love, and that is we follow the law of God not because just we fear God, because again, we're not fearing God, we're fearing the laws of God that which if we break, injure ourselves. What we really fear is our own choices, in other words. That's what the concept is really getting at. But Baha'u'llah says, don't follow my laws for, well, it's actually the Bab says that, and so one of the passages I got for you today. For fear of fire or for love of paradise. I'm terrible at paraphrasing the writings, but the idea is simply this. You should do this not because you fear you're going to hell, since hell doesn't exist anyway, or that you're going to suffer the consequences, or not because, gee, I want to be in that place where everybody's happy and so on, but because you love what you're doing. For the love of my beauty, follow my laws. In other words, this is best for you. Another passage Baha'u'llah says is that true liberty consisteth in strict obedience to my commandments, little as ye know it. And that little as ye know it is very important. It means if you could only see things as I see it, and eventually you will, you would realize that my laws are not in any way restrictive. They are the greatest freedom you can have and exercise those powers with which I have adorned you, such as will and love. All right. O son of being, bring thyself to account each day, ere thou art summoned to a reckoning, for death unheralded shall come upon thee, and thou shalt be called to give account for thy deeds. Hidden words. So we've done this axiom enough. First thing, life review. How are you going to do? Well, if you're exercising this process every day, there are not going to be too many surprises. Unheralded. The power of the faithful soul. Now, this is a passage I'm not going to spend too much time on, but it's an interesting one, because here Baha'u'llah is saying, when a faithful soul passes to the next world, that soul unleashes great power and is adorned with great power. In other words, we have service in the next world, even as we read in the Tablet of Ahmad, that if you read this tablet with sincerity, you will have service in both worlds. That's a good thing. So while the Protestant image of heaven that I grew up with was, you'll walk on streets of gold, you won't have to do anything, and so on, and that was terrifying to me as a kid, and is terrifying to me now, is boredom is terrifying to me. Well, the idea of service in something useful, that's exciting. He goes on to say, on down, the soul that hath remained faithful to the cause of God and stood unwaveringly firm in his path shall, after its ascension, his ascension, be possessed of such power that all the worlds which the Almighty hath created can benefit through him. In other words, that's a service that you will, if you have been faithful, release this power. Now, some of you are getting nervous at this point. And you should, because you don't know the whole story. You only know part of the story. And that is, it seems like everything that's going to happen to you is decided at this point. If you've been faithful, and who knows who that is, and which cause, it says the cause of God. Well, the cause of God to a Muslim is the Muslim faith. The cause of God to a Christian is the Christian faith. And there's no way that says that when you became a Baha'i yesterday, you were suddenly a different person. You chose a different path, but the person next door who's a Jew or a Muslim may be much more spiritual than you, much more advanced than you. And that goes back to an axiom we said the first day. You cannot assess the spiritual station of any other individual. You know, I often think that people that I see packing my groceries at the grocery store may be far above me since there's no spatial parameters in the next world. They won't be above. I'll just recognize that, my gosh, that was really a spiritual person, and I didn't even recognize what kind of internal process was going with that person, or what kind of service that person was rendering, what kind of spirit that person had. So here are some of the fears that we will have, or should have, or you will have at this point, because it sounds like a scary thing. You're going to be judged. But you aren't going to be judged. You're going to be judging yourself. That's made clear in the writings we've already read, that you will be confronted with your own actions. And some you'll feel good about, some of you'll feel bad about, and so on. And don't, as you consider this in an abstract way, as you reflect on it and meditate on it, don't forget the part that will plays in it. As you think about various people that seem to have, I think, I don't know if this is a worthwhile aside or not, but I think when I've seen these documentaries on people in maximum security prisons and these padded cells so they can't kill themselves and locked tightly so they can't kill others, worse off than animals, and they've done hideous things. And the only thing they want to do is destroy something. And particularly they want to destroy themselves. And so they injure themselves and so on. And I think, what does that accomplish? They really would be better off to pass on to the next world where they can progress. And that's what we're going to get to. About those who have died in sin and unbelief. What happens to them? You'll be surprised, maybe. So, the fears. Can we fail at the last moment? Now, here's a passage that strikes terror into most Baha'is. With all his heart, he, the person who is passing to the next world, should avoid fellowship with evildoers and pray for the remission of their sins. He should forgive the sinful and never despise his low estate, for none knoweth what his own end shall be. How often hath a sinner attained at the hour of death to the essence of faith, and quaffing the immortal draught, hath taken his flight unto the concourse on high. And how often hath a devout believer, and here's the scary part, at the hour of his soul's ascension, been so changed as to fall into the nethermost fire. Well, of course, there can't be a fire because there's no physical reality. So this has to be symbolic. Now, what is fire? What does this symbol mean to you? Well, I'll let you figure it out. It means, obviously, something scary. It means if the idea of fire to you is, it's an emotional state, obviously, right? A sense of fear, of doubt, of consternation, of depression, anxiety. Those of you who've had any of these feelings intensely, that's fire. That's awful. And if you read this, you would think, this is a God I would fear that would let this happen, because this seems patently unjust. Here's someone who's been good, if you might infer, all their lives, and here's someone who's been evil. And this person ends up in better shape than this person? Does that sound fair? That sounds capricious. And God is not capricious. So we must be misreading it. or there must be something else we don't understand. So let's get to it. But first, we have some other fears. Second fear, will we have any emotions in the next world? There's some people I know who fear that, well, we're just going to be sort of part of this spiritual glob. We won't have any identity, and we won't really feel anything because we won't have any individuality. But also, as I've said in the last class, since according to scientists who study the brain, emotions are caused by neurotransmitters crossing the synaptic cleft and causing you to feel great elation or great depression, depending on which are crossing, how fast they're crossing in your brain, and that's what causes emotion. Well, as I said, that's not exactly true. The emotion is really emanating from your essential self, but it's being translated by the brain. And sometimes the brain will translate it correctly, transparently. And sometimes if the brain is screwed up, you've had head trauma, or your diet is wrong, or you, for whatever reason, thousands of reasons that we're just discovering, the brain may make you feel other than what is really the true case with your being. So you can be a very spiritual person and have vile depression or any other disorder. All right? Or you could be a very evil person and feel very good, either because you have helped those neurotransmitters by injecting yourself with things that cause these serotonin to be very active and so forth. But if you believe in a materialistic, relativistic view of human construct, then you say, take away the brain, you got no emotion, because the neurotransmitters cause emotion. And yet, when you read the writings about the afterlife, we just talked about it. Someone's going to feel great joy, as no one could describe. You know, how are you going to feel joy if you got no neurotransmitters? Well, it must be that joy is a power of the soul, not the brain. Well, I gave the answer to that. But at any rate, if you believe in a materialistic view of the human being, then you also got to believe you've got no free will. That free will is an illusion. Why? Because if all the powers emanate from your brain, and the brain is a random confluence of all of these neurons and the way they're configured and affected by internal and external influences, then free will is simply the random choices that that thing in between your ears decides. Which means you really have no free will, which means you have no responsibility. And there was even a book written a few years ago now by a particle physicist at MIT who theorized that free will is just the illusion of authorship. That you have this illusion that you did something because you did certain actions and something occurred, but it's an illusion, you know. But for some reason they paid him royalty on the book. I don't know why, since he couldn't take credit for it, his brain did it. Fear number 3, if no free will, how can we instigate further spiritual development? And this is another one. A lot of people, many Baha'is, don't believe we have free will in the next world. Well, obviously our free will not be tested in the same way it is in this life, where we have, in effect, a metaphorical or dramatic parallel experience to the spiritual world. As one student mentioned after class yesterday, because I forgot to, we were saying that each of these two realms, the spiritual and the metaphysical and the physical, are counterpart of each other. And yet clearly the spiritual world is is the primary reality. And this, as Abdu'l-Baha says, this world is like a reflection on water of the spiritual world. This is a metaphorical, poetic expression. It's like God's poem. Physical reality is. but it's very close to paralleling spiritual reality. As we saw when we were talking about particle physics and the extent, the infinite universe, it comes very close to emulate exactly counterpart expressions of the principles that work in the spiritual realm, metaphysical realm. So, the idea is this: if we pass the next world and we have no free will, then in what sense are we retaining our identity, how can we do service if we don't have free will? Unless we're robots in the next world. We can pray for those who've passed on, as we just did this morning. And the writings say, even as they are praying for us. Well, if they're praying for us, or they do it free will, or they're forced to pray? Well, what value does a forced prayer have? You see what I'm saying? So by implication, implicitly, the writings say, you've got enough free will to pray and do some kind of service. The progress of man's spirit. Now, pay close attention here, those of you who've been Baha'is a long time particularly. This passage is the single most misunderstood passage in the Baha'i writings that I am aware of. There are a couple of others that come close. You take a passage out of context and you destroy the thing. You have to see the revelation as a whole, and you take a little sentence out of context and you think, well, that's the end of that. Well, it's not. This passage is taken at face value, so let's read it. How do we progress in the next world? This is fear number 3, no free will. The progress of man's spirit in the divine world, after the severance of its connection with the body of dust, is through the bounty, number 1, the bounty and grace of the Lord alone. 2, through the intercession and sincere prayers of other human souls. So we prayed for that soul this morning, and it will have an effect. Through the charities and important good works which are performed in its name. So that's one reason you would do well to make people think well of you, so that they'll, if you'll notice, all around here on this campus are names. This room was given in the name of this person who's passed on. So, where is free will in this paradigm? The bounty and grace of God. So if God chooses, who knows what God's going to do? Well, we should know what God's going to do. In other words, again, the fear here is resulting from our misunderstanding of the nature of God. God is not going to do anything illogical, capricious, unjust. God is infinitely loving, ever forgiving. So why should we fear God? Well, it says here, the bounty and grace of God alone. Maybe he will be, maybe he won't. He may have a good reason for not being gracious to me. So how am I going to advance in the next world? And so I put this hypothetical question to ourselves. Am I not going on a journey completely alone with none of my medications or stuff to a placeless place where I have never been, nor have I spoken with anyone who has ever been there, at least not for very long? Or even if they have been there, may have a different experience from what I might encounter. Furthermore, I do not have any idea when this unheralded journey will take place, possibly when I am least prepared. Why should I not be afraid? All right, answer to fear number 1. The concept of fire is clearly metaphorical or symbolic inasmuch as there is no physical existence in the spiritual world. The concept of experiencing fire is clearly alluding to an internal condition, possibly doubt or fear. This portrayal is focused on, and this is the most important part of refuting this fear.
The portrayal is focused on the initial emotional experience, not an eternal or fixed state, because there is no stasis in the afterlife. The writings say very clearly, nothing in this world or the next world is in a state of stasis. Everything is in motion. It's either progressing or regressing. And while there's no regression in the next world, he says stasis is tantamount to regression. So that's the first thing. So someone at the end, oh, I've lost my faith, I fear doubt. And I dare say most of you, however staunch your belief and however much service you have had moments of doubt, serious doubt or fear, or that I've lost it, I don't feel it, because faith is both logical and has emotional index as well. And I remember times when I felt that. But it doesn't endure. You have responses that you can make when that occurs. This is a statement explaining the symbolic nature of this. This is from the writings. Even the materialists have testified in their writings to the wisdom of these divinely appointed messengers, the prophets, and have regarded the references made by the prophets to paradise, to hellfire, to future reward and punishment, to have been actuated by a desire to educate and uplift the souls of men. And it goes on to say these are symbols. They aren't literal. So you're not going to fall in a nethermost fire literally, nor will you stay in that. And how do we answer that? Well, we'll see. Answer to fear number 2. If any man be told that which hath been ordained for such a soul, the soul of man, in the worlds of God, the Lord of the throne and high and earth below, his whole being will instantly blaze out in its great longing to attain that most exalted, that sanctified and resplendent station. And there's all kinds of stories that you've heard of people who had such a glimpse. And that's what's interesting about the people who have these NDE experiences. They don't want to come back here. Just a 20-second, 30-second glimpse of that environment. And they want to stay there. Interesting. They that are the followers of the one true God, we've already read this, shall the moment they depart out of this life experience such joy and gladness as would be impossible to describe. If the brain is working, now this is me writing, these aren't from the writings. If the brain is working properly, transparently, the neurotransmitters are conveying what the soul is feeling. Hence the care with which we attempt to apply medical treatment when the brain is not working properly. All right, to make it transparent. We discussed that 2 classes ago. Answer to fear number 3. And this is the biggie. Remember I said there's one passage that gets so misunderstood. Those 3 ways that we can progress in them: by the grace and bounty of God alone, by the prayers and intercessions of others, and by the works done in name. This is what occurs 231. The other page was, what, 270? So it's a little more than what I said. But it's page 231 in Some Answered Questions. Listen to this. It is even possible that the condition of those who have died in sin and unbelief may become changed. That is to say, they may become the object of the pardon through the bounty and grace of God. Well, that was number 1. Not through his justice. In other words, if he was strictly just, he would say, you didn't do well, you deserve what you get. But he's ever forgiving. What does ever mean? It means he's always forgiving. Doesn't stop. But it goes on. For bounty is giving without desert, and justice is giving what is deserved. As we have the power to pray for these souls here, so likewise we shall possess the same power in the other world, which is the kingdom of God. Are not all people in that world the creatures of God? Now, this is a continuation of the same passage. Therefore, in that world, they can make progress, those who've died in sin and unbelief. As here they can receive light by their supplications. Well, if you don't have free will to supplicate, then what is the supplication? The supplication implies free will. It requires free will. There also they can plead for forgiveness and receive light through entreaties and supplications. Thus, as the souls in this world, through the help of the supplications, the entreaties and prayers of the holy ones can acquire development, so is it the same after death. Through their own prayers and supplications, they can also progress, more especially when they are the object of the intercession of the holy manifestations. So, you see the difference between the initial experience, which may be, even though you've served all your life and done the best you could, you have a sudden sense of doubt. That's your initial experience. Even if you have done poorly, you can become changed. All right? But it requires some free will. And you can say, well, who wouldn't? You know, you're feeling horrible. Who would not supplicate? That's a question we could spend a couple of hours discussing. Is it possible that someone could be so depraved, have willfully, willingly gone against their better inclinations? Is it possible that they wouldn't know where to turn, or, well, that wouldn't make sense. I don't know. It's interesting to think about, though. Is it conceivable that someone wouldn't supplicate for assistance? So I've highlighted the important parts of that passage. Is there an unforgivable sin? I forgot that one. That's another fear. Is there some sin for which I cannot be pardoned? Many respond, this is my writing, not from the Baha'i writings. Many respond that a covenant breaker is beyond forgiveness. Now, a covenant breaker, for those of you who aren't Baha'is, is someone who is not just has broken the laws of Baha'u'llah, but who is actively, persistently, and against exhortations to do otherwise, has persistently tried to destroy the Baha'i faith. In the case of Mirza Yahya, he tried to kill Baha'u'llah and almost succeeded. He poisoned him. Surely those will not be forgiven. But in the Book of Laws, the most holy book of Baha'u'llah, he said, all you have to do, Mirza Yahya, to be forgiven is ask God for forgiveness. That's it. And here's the passage where he says it. Beware lest the fire of thy presumptuousness debar thee from the fire image again here. Here, fire is presumptuousness. Now, why was he presumptuous? Well, you have to read some Baha'i history to get that, and I don't have time to get into it, but suffice it to say, he was the half-brother of Baha'u'llah, and he wanted to be, he claimed to be the manifestation himself. Turn unto him, and fear not because of thy deeds. He in truth forgiveth whomsoever he desireth as a bounty on his part. No God is there but him, the ever-forgiving, the all-bounteous. We admonish thee solely for the sake of God. Shouldst thou accept this counsel, thou wilt have acted to thine own behoof. In other words, I'm not trying to do this because God needs you or anybody else needs you, but for your own salvation, your own protection. Verily, it says, thy Lord verily can dispense with thee and with all those who in manifest delusion have followed thee. Behold, God hath laid hold on him who led thee astray. Now, him who led him astray was Mirza Muhammad, Isfahan. Muhammad Ali of Isfahan. Yes, Isfahani. He was murdered. Part by Walashi took part in that, as you know, and served 7 years in prison because they couldn't stand it anymore. That's a long story, but it's a very interesting story. He will put away thee from thy sins, put thee away from thy sins, and so on. If you ask for forgiveness, it'll be yours. So, 2 things left with the few minutes we have. First, do we fear God? No, we fear ourselves. That sounds like I'm quoting from FDR, but I'm really quoting from the writings here. And this is The only unforgivable sin is detestation of the light. In other words, willfully rejecting the forgiveness of God. It's sort of like you can love your child as much as conceivably possible and find the most ingenious and heart-rending ways to try to reach them. But unless they are receptive to your love, you can't change them. You can't help them. And you, those of you who are parents, you know what I'm talking about. You have those moments. God willing, you don't have them last very long. But you get a sense of God's relation to us in a metaphorical way. This lamp is a lamp because of its light. Without the light, it would not be a lamp. Now, if a soul has an aversion for the light of the lamp, he is, as it were, blind and cannot comprehend the light, and blindness is the cause of everlasting banishment from God. Now, of course, this isn't an accident. This is a willful turning away. The meaning is this: to remain far from the light holder does not entail everlasting banishment, for one may become awakened and vigilant. In other words, this instant is only everlasting so long as you refuse to turn to the light. But enmity toward the light is the cause of everlasting. In other words, if you just can't stand the light, as is the case of Satan, for example, in Milton's Paradise Lost, that character, just, he can't stand it. Well, he actually says, I know I'd be happier if I turned to the light, but damn it, I'm just not going to do it. I just won't give in. He's willful. That's his fire burning within him, the desire to lead, even though he's leading a bunch of fallen angels. It's a beautiful piece of literature. If you hadn't read it, it's very long and it's in blank verse, and you probably never will. Two things then, and we're going to hit it right on the nose. This is the axiomatic statement that governs all of this we've just said. O Son of Being, love me, that I may love thee. If thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. Know this, O servant. Now, it doesn't mean that God is incapable of overwhelming you with his love. But the idea is, by definition, love is bilateral, not unilateral. Else it is something other than love. So someone can coerce you and force you to act as if you love them, but only you, through your free will, can respond. So what God has tried to contrive in creation is a systematic process by which reality is kind of veiled from us through our attraction to things. And yet, even that has a wisdom. And the final point is this: what is the point of salvation in the Baha'i faith? Anybody? Where is the point? In other words, when I became a Christian, officially, it was at age 12, and I took a course, and I was baptized at the altar, and I was, according to my teacher, Mrs. Brown, I was saved. I didn't feel like it, but apparently I was. You know. Now, I'm not making fun of that. I took it very seriously at the time, and Mrs. Brown took it even more seriously. All right? What is the point of salvation in the Baha'i faith? Anybody? So don't just mumble, hold up your hand and be daring. What? Yes. What? Okay. What she said was, you're on the right track if you recognize the manifestation and follow his teachings. And of course, that's what your next course is going to get into. Yes. She's precisely correct. And she said, there is no point at which you can say, there is no more possibility of my failure. There is no point. It's a process. All of life is this journey. When you become Baha'i, you decide, this is the path I will follow. But it is an endless journey. It's not a bad thing, because the journey is pleasant. So it's an endless journey towards being ever more felicitous in what you're doing, ever more rewarded, and so forth. It doesn't mean, in other words, some people, they hear that and they think, so I'm never going to be satisfied. No, you get to stages where you feel very confident, very confirmed. That's what the concept of the city of certitude is. You enter the city of certitude. But it doesn't mean you're ever going to stay there forever. You know. Any questions yes? Oh, okay. It's a good question, isn't it? When do we know we've been forgiven? I don't know. It's a totally subjective thing. It's that's the thing, is there is no priesthood, there's no group of people called the learned that have authority in this faith. The learned in this are people who serve in various institutions, but the only authority to which you can turn are the writings themselves. And so look in the writings and see if you can find the answer. My sense of it would be, I know I'm forgiven when I feel forgiven. And there's a prayer that we didn't get into that, about the confession. You're going to get into it in your workshop. Look at the writings that I have quoted in the passages for this class today. One of them is about confession. Why does Baha'u'llah say there should be no confession? In other words, where you are absolved by some authority. And the idea is because no one has such authority but God. And so you know when you pray and you presume that if you are sincere in your prayer that you have been forgiven. But there's an emotional affect that you sense. But that's one of the mysteries. I guess we don't know. Yes, Adam.
You said, and I'm getting close to what you said, that God doesn't judge you. There is no day of judgment where God judges you. You judge yourself.
No, I don't think it said that.
You said something real close to that, and I tried to get your attention.
It may have been close to that, but it wasn't that.
I apologize.
No, what I said is that we have no fear of God. What we really fear, in other words, we don't fear God's judgment. We fear that we may break ourselves on violating the laws of God. We have nothing to fear about God, was what I was saying. The judgment we were talking about, if you're talking about assessment as judgment, or you're talking about the assessment at the end of our lives in this review process, according to those who've had the NDEs, we become aware of what we've done in our lives. Now, who's conducting the awareness panel? We don't know. We do know this, that the Guardian says, even when we are talking about entering the presence of God, and I presume this is something Ken will cover, entering the presence of God is not a literal thing because God has no physical presence. Baha'u'llah talks about this in the Kitab-i-Iqan, the most important doctrinal work of the Baha'i revelation. He says, entering the presence of God means becoming familiar with and intimate with his representatives on this earth, who are the prophets of God. And so your intimacy with Baha'u'llah is the most intimately you can enter the presence of God, whether in this life or the next life. And thus in the passages I wrote for you today. So look at those passages and have fun with those questions, because they're dealing with a lot of these things about confession and so on. Okay, that's it. That's the time. I've enjoyed it.